The moment someone calls the cops to throw you off your own property, they've already made a mistake they can't take back. The sharp cry of gulls echoed across the water just as the first patrol SUV rolled onto the gravel parking area beside the old wooden dock. Morning mist still floated over the lake like a thin blanket, carrying the smell of wet pine, fresh water, and old cedar planks that had soaked up 50 summers of rain. I stood at the end of the dock holding nothing more dangerous than a fishing rod and a travel mug of black coffee that had already gone lukewarm. My aluminum fishing boat rocked gently against the weathered posts, its faded blue paint reflecting the first streaks of sunrise. Then I heard heels striking the boards behind me with quick, angry clicks. "Officer, that's him," the woman shouted before the deputies had even stepped out of their vehicles. "He's refusing to leave private HOA property." I turned slowly, already recognizing the voice. Melissa Harper, president of Lakewood Shores HOA, marched toward me wearing spotless white sneakers that somehow never touched dirt, oversized sunglasses despite the weak morning light, and the confident smile of someone who had never once been told no. She pointed directly at me as though she'd caught a criminal in the act. Behind her stood half a dozen homeowners clutching coffee cups, whispering among themselves while recording everything with their phones. Apparently, my quiet Saturday morning had become the neighborhood's entertainment. One deputy adjusted his duty belt before walking onto the dock. His boots made the old boards creak beneath every step. "Morning, sir," he said politely. "We received a complaint that you're trespassing and refusing lawful instructions to leave the HOA recreation area." I looked past him toward the water instead of answering immediately. Tiny ripples spread across the surface where a base had just broken the calm. The smell of fresh lake water mixed with the scent of gasoline from the patrol boats tied farther downshore. Everything about that morning felt peaceful except the people standing behind me. Melissa folded her arms with obvious satisfaction. "I've asked him 3 times to leave," she announced loudly enough for everyone filming to hear. "He refuses to join the HOA, refuses to follow our community rules, and keeps acting like he owns this lake." A few neighbors chuckled. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." The deputy looked back at me. "Sir, do you have any documentation giving you permission to be here today?" I almost smiled, not because the question was funny, but because I knew exactly where this road ended. 6 months earlier, I probably would have argued. I probably would have raised my voice, pointed fingers, and demanded everyone listen. Experience had taught me something far more valuable. When people are absolutely convinced they're right, the smartest thing you can do is let them keep talking. Melissa stepped closer until expensive perfume replaced the clean scent of the lake. "This wouldn't have happened if you'd simply paid your membership dues like everyone else," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Instead, you decided to make yourself everyone's problem." I took one slow sip of my coffee, looked across the water that had been part of my family's history longer than anyone in that subdivision had even known this place existed, and quietly replied, "That's an interesting way to describe my own lake. I have always believed that land remembers the people who respect it." Long before expensive homes circled the shoreline, and before matching mailboxes and decorative stone entrances appeared, this lake already had a name in my family. Walker Lake. My grandfather, Thomas Walker, bought the entire shoreline and the water rights in 1968 after returning from years of building highways across Texas. Everyone else saw an overlooked piece of rural property with muddy banks and fallen timber. Grandpa saw quiet mornings, honest work, and something that could stay in the family long after he was gone. Every summer of my childhood smelled like cedar smoke, fresh fish, sunscreen, and old pine boards warming beneath the afternoon sun. I learned how to cast a fishing line before I learned long division. My grandfather never rushed anything. He would sit beside me on this very dock with a tackle box older than my father, reminding me that patience usually won more battles than anger ever could. When he passed away, the lake became mine, along with a weathered cabin, the dock, several acres of surrounding woodland, and a responsibility that always felt larger than ownership. I never thought of myself as someone who possessed a lake. I simply considered myself the next caretaker. My career as a civil engineer kept me traveling across the country inspecting bridges, reservoirs, and public infrastructure. I understood property surveys, drainage easements, and county records better than most people ever needed to. That knowledge helped me professionally, but I rarely thought about applying it here because I never imagined anyone would seriously question who owned land that had been in my family for decades. Every few weeks I escaped the city, unlocked the cabin, swept the porch, checked the dock, and spent a quiet weekend fishing before driving back to another construction project. The cabin still looked almost exactly the way Grandpa had left it. His old cast-iron skillet hung above the stove. A faded photograph of him holding a 20-pound catfish rested beside the fireplace. Even the screen door made the same familiar squeak every time it opened. Those little sounds mattered because they reminded me that not everything in life needed to change. Then the subdivision arrived. At first it seemed harmless. New families moved into beautiful homes across the eastern shoreline. Children laughed from kayaks during the summer. Neighbors waved when I passed. I honestly believed we would all enjoy the lake together. But over the next few years, the community kept growing. Walking trails appeared. Decorative signs replaced old wooden markers. Private events became neighborhood festivals. Then someone formed a homeowners association with an impressive-sounding name and an even more impressive collection of rules. I barely noticed because none of it affected me. My property sat outside their development boundaries, and I had never signed a single homeowners association agreement. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, the more successful the neighborhood became, the more people forgot there had ever been a family here before the subdivision existed. Somewhere along the way, they stopped referring to it as Walker Lake. They started calling it the Lakewood Shores Community Lake. It sounded official enough that most newcomers never questioned it. Unfortunately for them, names printed on glossy brochures do not rewrite property records. Melissa Harper did not invent control. She simply perfected the art of making people believe they had already agreed to it. By the time I met her, she had spent nearly 5 years transforming the Homeowners Association from a neighborhood committee into something that felt more like a private government. She was one of the top real estate agents in the county, the kind whose smiling face appeared on billboards beside highways promising luxury waterfront living. Every new home she sold near the shoreline increased her commissions. Every photograph of happy families kayaking across the lake made her listings more valuable. The lake was not just scenery to Melissa. It was the centerpiece of her business model. That explained why she smiled every time she talked about community improvements. The improvements were always attached to another property sale somewhere. The first time we officially met, she arrived at my cabin carrying a gift basket filled with gourmet coffee, homemade cookies, and a glossy folder embossed with the Lakewood Shores logo. Even then I noticed how carefully she studied everything around her. Her eyes lingered on the dock, the boat lift, the shoreline, and the cabin before returning to me with the polished smile she probably practiced every morning. She introduced herself as though we were already neighbors, congratulated me on owning such a beautiful piece of waterfront property, then casually slid the folder onto my porch table. Inside was a membership application, a schedule of monthly dues, architectural guidelines, marina regulations, boating rules, fishing restrictions, and several pages explaining the wonderful benefits of becoming part of the community. I thanked her for stopping by, handed the folder back, and politely explained that my property had never belonged to the Homeowners Association. She laughed softly as if I had misunderstood something obvious. She assured me everyone around the lake eventually joined because it made life easier. I smiled and wished her a pleasant afternoon. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, it became the beginning of a campaign that lasted for months. Every few weeks, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. Friendly reminders became formal invitations. Invitations became notices. Notices slowly evolved into documents carrying official-sounding language about shared amenities, recreational compliance, and community obligations. Whenever we crossed paths near the shoreline, Melissa remained perfectly pleasant. She never shouted. She never threatened. That almost made it more unsettling. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who genuinely believed reality would eventually adjust itself to match her expectations. During one neighborhood picnic, I overheard her giving a tour to prospective buyers. She stood beside the water with one arm extended across the lake like a television host unveiling a grand prize. She described private boating events, seasonal fishing tournaments, sunset cruises, and exclusive lake access for association members. Listening from my dock, I noticed something she never mentioned. She never once said the Homeowners Association owned the lake because legally she could not. Instead, she carefully used phrases that sounded close enough for people to assume it. Community lake, neighborhood waterfront, resident shoreline, exclusive member access. Each sentence blurred the line between using something and owning it. People nodded without asking questions because confident voices often sound like facts. I remember watching the sunlight reflect across the water that afternoon, thinking my grandfather would have shaken his head at how easily polished brochures could replace history in the minds of people who had only just arrived. The first real change appeared on a Monday morning when I pulled into the gravel parking area beside my cabin and noticed a brand new aluminum sign planted beside the boat ramp. The fresh concrete around its base had not even fully dried. Blue letters stretched across the polished metal. Lakewood Shores residents only. Membership required beyond this point. I stood there for a long moment listening to the soft splash of water against the dock while a pair of geese drifted across the cove, completely unaware that humans had decided to invent invisible boundaries overnight. The sign was not on my land, but it faced directly toward my dock as if it had always belonged there. I took a photograph, shrugged, unlocked my cabin, and spent the weekend fishing. 2 weeks later, another surprise greeted me. A decorative kiosk appeared beside the shoreline covered with maps, event schedules, boating regulations, and colorful flyers advertising the annual Summer Lake Festival. Families were encouraged to reserve boat slips, register for fishing tournaments, and purchase seasonal recreation passes through the Homeowners Association office. The entire display presented the lake as though it had always operated under their management. My dock appeared on one of the printed maps, without anyone ever asking permission to include it. I called the association office, explained the mistake, and asked that my property be removed from future materials. The receptionist apologized politely and promised someone would look into it. Nothing changed. Instead, the following month brought floating buoys marking swimming zones that reached closer to my shoreline than ever before. Volunteers installed picnic tables near the eastern bank. Weekend paddleboard classes filled quiet mornings with cheerful voices and whistles. None of those activities bothered me by themselves. People enjoying a beautiful lake had never been the problem. The problem was that each new addition quietly reinforced the illusion that someone else controlled everything surrounding the water. Melissa understood something many people never notice. Ownership often changes in the public imagination long before anyone attempts to challenge it legally. The more signs people read, the more maps they followed, and the more events they attended, the more they accepted a version of reality built on repetition instead of facts. Then came the invoices. The first one requested annual waterfront maintenance, dues totaling $680. I assumed it had been mailed by mistake and ignored it. A second envelope arrived 30 days later describing the amount as overdue. Another letter warned that continued refusal to comply could affect access privileges to community recreational facilities. I laughed quietly while reading that sentence on my own dock. A week later, I found a laminated notice attached to one of my fence posts informing me that unauthorized private structures required architectural review by the association board. My grandfather had built that fence decades before the subdivision even existed. The smell of fresh laminate still lingered as I peeled the notice away and slipped it into my truck instead of throwing it out. Something told me every piece of paper might become important one day. The final step came when a private security patrol stopped beside my cabin one Saturday afternoon. The guard remained courteous, almost embarrassed, as he explained that association records showed I had declined mandatory membership and therefore should avoid using common waterfront amenities until the matter could be resolved. I thanked him for being respectful, wished him a safe day, and watched his golf cart disappear around the curve. Melissa was no longer asking me to join. She was slowly building a world where everyone else believed I already had. By the time summer arrived, Melissa announced the largest neighborhood celebration Lakewood Shores had ever hosted. Every mailbox in the subdivision received glossy invitations printed on heavy cardstock featuring fireworks over the water, live music, food trucks, fishing contests, and sunset boat rides. A huge banner stretched across the entrance road welcoming everyone to the first annual Community Lake Festival. Looking at the advertisements, no one would have guessed that every photograph centered around a lake the Homeowners Association did not actually own. I almost skipped my usual weekend trip, but routine had always grounded me. Early Saturday morning, I drove to the cabin, unlocked the front door, brewed coffee in my grandfather's old enamel pot, and carried my favorite folding chair onto the dock. Music drifted across the water as vendors set up colorful tents along the eastern shoreline. Children laughed while inflatable kayaks were unloaded from trailers. It looked like a postcard, and honestly, I hoped everyone enjoyed themselves. Families creating happy memories had never been my enemy. Around mid-morning, I noticed several temporary signs pointing visitors toward what they called the community marina. One arrow pointed directly toward my dock. A few confused guests even wandered onto my property asking where they could check in for boat rentals. Each time I smiled, explained they were standing on private property, and pointed them back toward the festival area. Most apologized immediately. They had simply followed the signs. Around noon, Melissa climbed onto a small stage beside the shoreline with a wireless microphone and welcomed hundreds of residents to what she proudly described as the crown jewel of the community. She thanked volunteers, recognized sponsors, praised neighborhood growth, and spoke enthusiastically about preserving shared waterfront traditions for generations to come. Standing quietly beside my boat, I realized she had become so comfortable repeating the same story that she probably believed every word herself. Then I heard my name carried across the loudspeaker. Melissa smiled toward the crowd before turning in my direction. She politely informed everyone that one nearby property owner had repeatedly refused to cooperate with community standards despite numerous opportunities to participate. She never insulted me directly, but the implication was obvious enough that dozens of people turned to stare. Some whispered. Others shook their heads without knowing anything about me beyond the version they had just heard. A few minutes later, Melissa walked toward my dock accompanied by 2 event volunteers and several residents holding their phones. She stopped a few feet away and asked one final time whether I intended to register with the Homeowners Association before using what she described as neighborhood facilities. I calmly explained, just as I always had, that I respected her community but had no legal obligation to join it. Her smile disappeared for the first time since I had met her. Without raising her voice, she reached into her purse, removed her cell phone, and placed a call. I could not hear every word, but I clearly heard her request law enforcement assistance regarding an individual refusing to leave association property. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When she ended the call, she looked at me with complete confidence, as though the outcome had already been decided. Nearly everyone nearby continued watching instead of returning to the festival. The cheerful music still floated across the lake, but it suddenly sounded very far away. Less than 15 minutes later, the flashing lights I had seen at the beginning of this story appeared at the end of the gravel road, and an ordinary summer celebration quietly transformed into the moment that would unravel everything Melissa had spent years trying to build. The deputies handled the situation professionally. They listened to Melissa first, accepted the folder she confidently handed them, then turned their attention to me without making assumptions. One of them explained that the Homeowners Association records identified this entire shoreline as a managed recreation area and asked whether I had anything supporting my claim that I belonged there. I answered honestly, not with me. That was enough for Melissa to let out the quiet, satisfied smile she had been waiting months to show. Around us, festival guests continued recording with their phones while pretending not to stare. I could almost hear the story spreading from one conversation to the next. The stubborn man who refused to follow the neighborhood rules was finally being confronted. I did not argue because arguments disappear as quickly as they are spoken. Evidence lasts much longer. After the deputies finished asking questions, I agreed to leave for the afternoon while they sorted through the conflicting claims. One of them even thanked me for remaining calm. I loaded my fishing rod, untied my boat, secured the cabin, and drove away with every eye following my truck down the narrow gravel road. Melissa probably believed she had won. Most people would have thought exactly the same thing. Even I admitted the moment stung more than I expected. My grandfather had taught me to stand tall, yet I had just walked away from the place where nearly every important childhood memory had been made. The cabin looked strangely lonely in my rearview mirror as tall pine trees slowly swallowed it from sight. Instead of driving home, I stopped at a small diner about 20 miles away that my grandfather used to visit after long mornings on the lake. The waitress recognized me immediately and poured coffee before I even sat down. As I stirred the cup, I kept replaying every conversation I had ever had with Melissa. Every letter, every invoice, every sign, every brochure. None of them actually claimed legal ownership outright. They simply encouraged everyone else to assume it. That realization settled into my mind like the final piece of a puzzle. I finished my lunch, drove straight back to the cabin after the festival had ended, unlocked the front door, and began opening cabinets that had not been touched in years. Dust floated through narrow beams of evening sunlight. Old tackle boxes, family photographs, faded road maps, and weathered notebooks covered the shelves exactly as my grandfather had left them. Then I remembered something he once told me when I was barely 12 years old. The papers mattered just as much as the land. Behind a stack of fishing magazines sat a small green metal lockbox with chipped paint around the edges. The key still hung on the same nail inside the kitchen pantry. My hands were steady as I opened the lid. Inside rested neatly organized folders wrapped in wax paper, each labeled in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Warranty deed, original boundary survey, water rights agreement, title insurance policy. Beneath those documents lay a folded letter addressed simply to Ethan. I had seen the box many years before, but never had a reason to study its contents. Tonight felt different. Outside, the lake reflected the orange glow of sunset through the cabin window, calm and unchanged despite everything that had happened. Inside, I unfolded the first document and immediately realized my grandfather had left behind far more than memories. He had left behind every answer I was going to need. I spent the next several days doing something Melissa never expected. Nothing. At least that was how it looked from the outside. I did not send angry emails. I did not post complaints online. I did not march into the homeowners association office carrying a stack of documents. Instead, I quietly let everyone continue believing the story they had already accepted. Meanwhile, every evening after work I returned to the cabin, spread my grandfather's records across the old oak dining table, and began assembling a timeline that stretched back more than 50 years. The original warranty deed transferred not only the surrounding acreage, but also the lake itself, along with clearly described riparian rights. The boundary survey contained precise bearings, distances, and permanent survey markers that still existed beneath the soil. A separate agreement recorded decades earlier confirmed the family's exclusive water rights. As a civil engineer, I knew these documents were valuable, but paper alone was never enough. Modern evidence would have to match historical records perfectly. I hired an independent licensed land surveyor with no connection to the county or the neighborhood. We spent 2 full days locating original iron survey pins that my grandfather had described in handwritten notes. Most were still exactly where they had been driven into the ground decades before. We used high-precision global positioning system equipment to verify every property corner, every shoreline measurement, and every easement. Then I hired a drone operator to capture current aerial imagery showing every dock, every floating buoy, every sign, every picnic table, and every section of shoreline the Homeowners Association claimed to manage. After that, I requested certified copies of county property records, historical subdivision plats, tax assessments, and archived aerial photographs dating back before the neighborhood even existed. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. The Homeowners Association boundaries stopped well short of the lake. Their subdivision included beautiful waterfront homes, but not the water itself. Even more surprising, several of their newest recreational improvements extended beyond their legal property lines. The floating swimming area, portions of the community boat launch, and part of the decorative boardwalk all rested within property protected by my family's deed. I never interrupted their activities because I wanted every improvement documented exactly where they had chosen to place it. During that same period, Melissa continued expanding the association's events. Membership advertisements promised exclusive boating privileges. Seasonal recreation fees were collected from residents. Additional signs appeared directing visitors toward facilities described as community-managed waterfront amenities. I photographed every new sign, saved every brochure, and collected every newsletter that arrived in my mailbox. None of it required exaggeration because the truth was becoming stronger than anything I could have invented. One evening I unfolded the handwritten letter my grandfather had left inside the lockbox. The paper had yellowed with age, but his careful handwriting remained perfectly clear. Near the bottom, he had written a sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the letter shut. He wrote that people often confuse confidence with ownership, but the courthouse keeps better memories than pride ever will. Sitting alone inside the quiet cabin with crickets singing outside the screened windows and the familiar scent of cedar filling the room, I realized I finally understood why he had preserved every document so carefully. He was never collecting paper. He was protecting the truth until the day someone needed to prove it. The county administrative hearing was scheduled for a quiet Tuesday morning inside a modest government building that looked far less dramatic than the months of preparation leading to it. Melissa arrived with 2 board members, a thick presentation binder, and the same confident expression I had seen since the day she first stepped onto my porch carrying a membership packet. Several residents attended out of curiosity, including a few who had recorded the festival weeks earlier. They probably expected another disagreement about association rules. Instead, they were about to witness a discussion about property records that stretched back more than half a century. The hearing officer began by asking both sides to explain their positions. Melissa spoke first. She described the Homeowners Association's responsibility to maintain recreational amenities, preserve neighborhood standards, and manage community access around the lake. She referenced newsletters, maintenance expenses, volunteer programs, and years of uninterrupted operation. Listening carefully, I noticed she never once claimed to possess an original deed transferring ownership of the lake because no such document existed. When it was my turn, I placed a single folder on the table. Inside rested certified copies of the original warranty deed, the historical boundary survey, the recorded water rights agreement, the title insurance records, current license survey results, county tax documents, and recent aerial photography. One by one, each document confirmed the next. The hearing officer compared survey coordinates, examined property descriptions, and matched them against current county maps displayed on a large monitor. The licensed surveyor I had hired explained how original iron markers had been recovered and verified using modern global positioning system measurements. Every coordinate aligned with the documents recorded decades earlier. Then the drone imagery appeared on the screen. High-resolution photographs showed the shoreline exactly as it existed today. Colored overlays placed legal property boundaries directly over current structures. The room became noticeably quieter as everyone watched the images. The floating swimming area extended beyond the Homeowners Association property. The decorative boardwalk crossed onto land protected by my family's deed. Even part of the community boat launch occupied property that had never belonged to the association. Melissa leaned forward studying the maps with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It looked more like genuine surprise. The hearing officer asked a simple question that changed the atmosphere completely. Can the association provide a recorded deed establishing ownership of the lake or the disputed shoreline? Several seconds passed before Melissa quietly answered that she could not. That silence carried more weight than any argument either of us could have made. After reviewing the complete record, the county concluded that the Homeowners Association possessed authority only within its legally recorded boundaries and had no ownership interest in the lake itself or the portions of shoreline identified by the survey. The association was instructed to remove inaccurate signs, correct public materials describing the property, and coordinate with the appropriate agencies regarding any structures extending beyond its recorded boundaries. As the meeting ended, residents gathered around the displayed maps instead of around Melissa. Some quietly apologized for assumptions they had made. Others admitted they had simply believed what they had always been told. I collected my documents, thanked the hearing officer, and stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight. The breeze carried the familiar scent of pine from the direction of the lake, and for the first time in months, it felt as though the truth no longer needed me to defend it because the records had finally spoken for themselves. 3 weeks later, I drove back to the cabin just before sunrise, and for the first time in months the shoreline looked familiar again. The aluminum signs claiming exclusive association control had disappeared. The temporary ropes marking private recreation zones were gone. The colorful banners advertising community waterfront privileges had been taken down, leaving only open water reflecting the pale orange light of a new morning. The lake had not changed at all. Only the stories people told about it had. As I walked onto the dock, The old cedar boards creaked beneath my boots exactly the way they had since I was a boy. The air smelled of fresh water, pine needles, and coffee drifting from the mug warming my hands. A pair of herons lifted quietly from the far bank, circling once before disappearing into the trees. It felt as though the lake had simply been waiting for the noise to end. Over the following month, several neighbors stopped by the cabin, not to argue, but to introduce themselves properly. Many admitted they had moved into the subdivision believing everything they had been told during home tours. They assumed the homeowners association owned the water because nobody had ever suggested otherwise. I could not blame them for trusting what sounded official. A few even apologized for recording the confrontation during the festival without knowing the full story. I accepted every apology because carrying resentment would have accomplished nothing my grandfather would have admired. One Saturday morning, I replaced the old weathered sign near the entrance to my property with a simple cedar board carved by a local craftsman. It read, "Walker Lake. Visitors welcome. Please respect nature." There was no mention of lawsuits, hearings, or homeowners associations. The sign did not celebrate victory. It simply acknowledged the truth that had always been there. Families continued fishing from the public areas that legally belonged to them. Children still laughed from kayaks during the summer. Birdwatchers brought binoculars during migration season. The difference was that everyone now understood where public access ended and private property began. Respect replaced assumption, and surprisingly, the lake felt more welcoming than it ever had before. One afternoon, I unfolded my grandfather's handwritten letter again while sitting on the dock. The paper still carried the faint scent of the old cabin where it had rested for so many years. I reread the final line slowly. He had written that ownership was never about telling people what they could not do. Real stewardship meant preserving something valuable so future generations could enjoy it with honesty and respect. Looking across the calm water, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Melissa eventually moved on from leading the homeowners association, and another board took her place with a far better understanding of the recorded property lines. We rarely crossed paths after that, and when we did, our conversations remained brief and courteous. Life has a way of becoming peaceful once the truth no longer needs to compete with assumptions. Every now and then someone asks me whether calling the authorities that morning embarrassed me. I always smile before answering. Embarrassment fades. Records do not. Patience does not. The truth does not. In the end, nobody remembered the loud accusations nearly as much as they remembered the quiet stack of documents that had been waiting inside an old green lockbox all along. My grandfather was right. Confidence may convince a crowd for a little while, but sooner or later the courthouse remembers what pride forgets, and justice rarely arrives with the loudest voice. It arrives with the strongest proof.